The candles had barely been lit when Eleanor Whitfield felt the first wave of panic rise in her chest. She stood at the edge of the ballroom, her gloved hands pressed together, watching the crowd swirl in silk and laughter, and she knew that within the hour, everything she had tried to hide would come apart in front of every person who mattered in her world. The Ashcombe estate glowed with hundreds of candles that night. Every window on the ground floor spilled golden light onto the lawn, and carriages lined the drive for what seemed like a mile. Eleanor had arrived late, slipping in through a side entrance with her aunt, hoping to avoid the attention that came so easily to girls with better names and larger dowries. She wanted only to watch the evening pass, to nod politely when spoken to, and to leave before anyone noticed her too closely. But someone did notice her. Duke Edmund Ashcombe crossed the ballroom floor with the kind of quiet authority that made conversations pause without anyone quite realizing why. He was tall, composed, and known throughout the county for choosing his words as carefully as he chose his friendships, which was to say rarely, and with great deliberation. Women had spent entire seasons trying to earn a second glance from him. Eleanor had not tried at all, which was perhaps why he looked twice. He approached her near the tall windows overlooking the garden, where she had positioned herself specifically to be forgotten. "You are not dancing," he said, not as a question. Eleanor turned, startled that he had spoken to her directly. "I prefer to watch, Your Grace." "A shame," he replied. "The room is full of people trying too hard to be seen. It is rare to find someone who isn't." She did not know how to respond to that, so she said nothing, and he did not seem to mind the silence. They spoke for only a few minutes before he was pulled away by an older gentleman eager to discuss matters of business. But something had shifted in that brief exchange, something neither of them could yet name. Eleanor watched him go and felt a warmth she had not permitted herself to feel in a very long time. She should not have allowed it. She knew that even as it happened, her guardian, Lord Gerald Whitfield, had made her circumstances painfully clear only 2 days before the ball. He was her late father's cousin, a man who had taken control of her inheritance and her future the moment her parents had died, and he had arranged, without asking her opinion on the matter, a marriage to Viscount Nathaniel Crane. The Viscount was twice her age, deeply in debt beneath his fine coats, and eager to attach himself to whatever remained of her father's fortune before it slipped away entirely. "You will smile at the ball," Gerald had told her, standing over her with the same cold patience he always used when issuing instructions disguised as suggestions. "You will not embarrass this family, and you will remember that your situation depends entirely on my goodwill." Eleanor had learned, over the 3 years since her parents' deaths, exactly what her guardian's goodwill was worth. She had learned to keep her opinions folded small inside her, to agree quickly, to avoid drawing his attention whenever possible. She had learned that the alternative to obedience was punishment, delivered quietly enough that no one outside the household would ever suspect it. So when Duke Edmund Ashcombe found her again later that evening, this time requesting the honor of the final dance, Eleanor felt something close to hope, and hope, she knew, was the most dangerous thing a girl in her position could carry. "I would be glad to," she told him, and meant it more than she had meant anything in years. He smiled, the kind of smile that reached his eyes rather than merely his mouth, and told her he would find her again, once the musicians called the final set. Eleanor spent the next hour in a state she could not describe, equal parts joy and dread, because she understood precisely what a final dance with a duke meant to everyone watching. It was not a casual gesture. It was a declaration, one that would travel through the county within days, one that her guardian would hear before the candles were even extinguished. And when he heard it, he would know exactly how to destroy it. Eleanor found her aunt near the refreshment table and pulled her gently aside. "I cannot dance with him," she whispered. "Not the final dance. You know what will happen if Gerald hears of it." Her aunt, a kind but powerless woman who had long ago given up trying to protect Eleanor from her guardian's control, took her hand. "Then leave now, dear, before it is too late to choose quietly." It was, Eleanor thought, the only sensible option left to her. If she vanished before the final dance, there would be no declaration for Gerald to punish, no public moment for Nathaniel Crane's pride to demand satisfaction over, no scandal that could reach back and crush the fragile safety her aunt and younger cousins depended on. She could disappear into the night, and by morning, the ball would be nothing more than gossip about a strange, quiet girl who had left early. She told herself this was the safer path. She told herself the Duke would forget her within a week, that a man of his standing had far better prospects than a girl with no dowry and a guardian drowning in debts of his own making. She told herself many things as she slipped toward the side entrance, her heart pounding louder with every step. She did not look back at the ballroom. She could not allow herself to. The night air outside was sharp and cold, a welcome contrast to the heat of the crowded room. Eleanor pulled her shawl tighter and moved quickly along the gravel path toward the waiting carriages, praying she would find her aunt's driver before anyone noticed her absence. She was 3 steps from the carriage line when she heard her name called from the ballroom doors behind her, in a voice she recognized instantly. Edmund had come looking for her already. Eleanor did not turn. She could not trust herself to look at him and still walk away. She quickened her pace instead, slipping between 2 carriages, praying the darkness would hide her long enough to escape. Inside the ballroom, confusion rippled outward from the doors where Edmund stood searching the crowd. The musicians had begun the opening notes of the final set, and every eye in the room turned toward the empty space where Eleanor should have been standing beside him. Whispers started immediately, the kind that would harden into rumor before the night was through. "She's gone," someone murmured near the punch table. "Ran off, more like," another voice added, delighted by the drama of it. Edmund said nothing. He simply turned and walked back through the doors he had just come from, ignoring the questions thrown at him from every direction, his jaw set in a way none of his household staff had seen in years. He found his valet near the entrance hall and spoke low and fast. "Have my horse brought around. Now." "Your Grace, the final dance." "Now," Edmund repeated, and the valet did not ask again. Outside, Eleanor had reached her aunt's carriage, but the driver was nowhere in sight, likely gathered with the other servants near the kitchens waiting for the ball to end. She pressed herself against the carriage wheel, breathing hard, wondering how far she could get on foot before someone from the house noticed a young woman walking alone in the dark. She did not have long to wonder. Behind her, the sound of the front doors opening again cut through the quiet night, followed by fast, purposeful footsteps on the gravel. Eleanor's heart climbed into her throat. She knew, without turning, exactly who had followed her outside. Eleanor. His voice was closer now, urgent in a way it had not been inside the ballroom. She turned slowly, and found him standing only a few feet away, his formal coat still buttoned, his expression a mixture of confusion and something rawer underneath it. "Your Grace, Why did you run?" he asked, cutting through whatever explanation she had been about to offer. "One moment we had an understanding, and the next you vanished as though the house were on fire." Eleanor opened her mouth, then closed it again. There was no version of the truth she could give him that would not expose her guardian's cruelty, her family's desperate finances, or the marriage that had already been arranged without her consent. To tell him anything would be to hand him a weapon he might use rashly, one that could bring consequences down on her aunt and cousins long after Edmund himself had lost interest in the matter. "I am sorry," she said instead, her voice trembling despite her effort to keep it steady. "I should not have accepted your invitation to dance. It was a mistake." "A mistake," Edmund repeated slowly, studying her face in the dim light spilling from the house windows. "You do not look like a woman who believes that." Eleanor felt tears threaten and forced them back. "Please, Your Grace. Let me go. It would be better for both of us if you simply forgot this evening." "I will not forget it," he said, and something in his tone told her he meant it as more than politeness. "Something is wrong. I saw it in your face the moment I asked you to dance, and I see it now. Tell me what it is." For one dangerous moment, Eleanor almost did. The words rose in her throat, ready to spill out into the cold night air. The whole terrible arrangement with Nathaniel Crane, the threats her guardian had made against her aunt's small household, the years of careful obedience that had brought her exactly nowhere. But then the sound of another carriage approaching the drive broke the moment, and Eleanor remembered herself, remembered exactly how much danger honesty could bring. "I cannot," she whispered. "Please, do not follow me. I beg you." She turned and walked quickly into the darkness beyond the carriage line, toward the road that led away from the estate, leaving Edmund standing alone among the waiting horses and idle drivers, watching her disappear into the night, with a question burning in his chest that he had no intention of leaving unanswered. He did not call after her again. He simply stood very still, watching the shape of her fade into shadow, and made a decision that would carry him far beyond the boundaries of a single evening's disappointment. Whatever secret she was protecting, whatever fear had driven her to vanish before the final dance, he intended to find it, and he intended to find her, no matter how far into the night he had to follow. Behind him, the music inside the ballroom continued without them, bright and oblivious, while outside in the cold, something far more consequential had already begun. 3 years earlier, Eleanor Whitfield had been a different person entirely. She had lived in a modest but happy house on the edge of Winmore Village with her mother and father, a retired naval officer who had built a small but respectable fortune through careful investment rather than inherited wealth. She had wanted for nothing important, had laughed easily, had believed the world was generally a kind and orderly place. That belief had died along with her parents, when a fever swept through Winmore during a wet spring and took both of them within a week of each other. Eleanor was 17 at the time, too young by law to manage her own inheritance, and the courts had appointed her father's cousin, Gerald Whitfield, as her guardian. He had arrived at the house within days of the funeral, dressed in mourning black that did nothing to disguise the calculation already working behind his eyes. At first Gerald had seemed almost kind. He spoke gently of duty and family obligation, assured Eleanor that her father's fortune would be protected and grown under his careful management, and moved her and her aunt into a smaller but comfortable house near his own estate so that he might, in his words, watch over her properly. It took nearly a year for Eleanor to understand what watching over her actually meant. Gerald had inherited significant debts from his own late father, debts he had spent the better part of a decade hiding from polite society through careful lies and borrowed appearances. Eleanor's inheritance, modest by aristocratic standards but substantial by the standards of a struggling gentleman, offered him exactly the kind of relief he needed, provided he could control it long enough to make use of it. He began slowly, small withdrawals explained as necessary expenses, investments that never seemed to produce the returns he promised. By the time Eleanor turned 19, old enough to legally question his management, she discovered that nearly half of what her father had left her had vanished into accounts and arrangements she could not trace. Hidden behind Gerald's practiced explanations and forged signatures she had no way to prove were false. When she confronted him quietly, in the privacy of his study, his kindness had disappeared entirely, replaced by something colder and far more honest. "You will say nothing of this to anyone," he had told her, his voice flat and final. "You have no proof, no standing, and no one who would believe a penniless girl over a respected gentleman. Your aunt depends on my charity to keep a roof over her head. Your younger cousins depend on the small allowance I provide for their education. If you make trouble for me, Eleanor, I promise you that charity will end, and it will not end for me. It will end for them." Eleanor had understood, in that moment, exactly how trapped she was. She could not fight Gerald without endangering the only family she had left, and she could not leave without resources of her own, since whatever remained of her inheritance was locked entirely under his control until she married or reached an age still years away. So she had folded herself smaller. She had learned to agree quickly, to avoid his attention, to survive by making herself as invisible as possible within her own life. Then, 6 months before the ball at Ashcombe Estate, Gerald's debts had grown desperate enough that he needed a faster solution than slow theft from an inheritance that was dwindling regardless. He found it in Viscount Nathaniel Crane, a man nearly twice Eleanor's age, whose family name still carried weight in society despite a fortune that had eroded almost entirely away over 2 generations of poor decisions. The arrangement between the two men had been simple and cold. Nathaniel would marry Eleanor, gaining access to whatever remained of her inheritance and the respectability of a young, well-mannered wife to repair his reputation. Gerald, in exchange, would receive a significant sum from Nathaniel's remaining assets, enough to settle his most pressing debts and buy himself several more years of comfortable pretending. Eleanor had not been asked, she had been informed. "The engagement will be announced within the month," Gerald had told her over breakfast one morning, as casually as if he were discussing the weather. "Viscount Crane is a respectable man. You should consider yourself fortunate that a match of this quality has been arranged for someone in your circumstances." Eleanor had wanted to scream. Instead, she had set down her teacup very carefully and asked only one question, "And if I refuse?" Gerald had smiled, the same cold smile he always wore when reminding her of her position. "Then your aunt loses her home, your cousins lose their education, and you lose whatever small dignity remains to you when I explain to the county precisely why a girl of your background cannot secure a match on her own merits. Refuse if you like, Eleanor. See how quickly your family suffers for your pride." She had not refused. She had nodded, thanked him for his consideration, and retreated to her room to cry where no one could see her. Nathaniel Crane himself was not a cruel man in any obvious way, which somehow made the arrangement feel worse rather than better. He was polite when they were introduced, complimented her manner and appearance in the flat, practiced way of a man reciting lines he had used many times before, and showed absolutely no interest in who she actually was beyond the financial value she represented. He spoke to Gerald more than he spoke to her during their first meeting, discussing terms and timelines as though Eleanor herself were simply another asset being transferred between owners. She understood. watching the two men talk over her future without once asking her opinion, that her life had already been decided. The wedding would take place within 2 months of the official engagement announcement. She would move into Nathaniel's crumbling family estate, produce heirs to secure his bloodline, and spend the rest of her days as a quiet, useful accessory to a man who valued her inheritance far more than her company. It was into this narrow, suffocating future that Duke Edmund Ashcombe had unknowingly stepped, offering Eleanor a single evening of something she had almost forgotten existed, the sense that someone might see her as a person rather than a problem to be solved, or an asset to be transferred. That was precisely why she had to run from him. If Gerald learned that a duke had shown public interest in Eleanor, requesting the final dance in front of the entire county, it would not simply embarrass Nathaniel Crane. It would enrage him, and it would give Gerald a reason to accelerate the wedding date before any complications could interfere with his arrangement. Worse, if Edmund pursued the matter and discovered the truth about her engagement, about Gerald's manipulation of her inheritance, there was no telling what a man of his standing might do, and no guarantee it would end well for anyone involved, least of all Eleanor's aunt and cousins, who remained entirely dependent on Gerald's continued goodwill. She had thought, walking away from Edmund in the dark outside the Ashcombe estate, that she was choosing the safer path for everyone. She had thought that disappearing quietly, before any declaration could be made public, would protect the people she loved from consequences they had done nothing to deserve. She had not accounted for the possibility that Edmund Ashcombe was not a man who accepted an unexplained retreat as an answer. By the time Eleanor reached the main road leading away from the estate, her thin dancing shoes already damp from the wet grass, she heard the unmistakable sound of hooves on gravel behind her, moving fast. She turned, heart hammering, expecting perhaps a servant sent to retrieve her, or worse, word already reaching Gerald about her strange behavior at the ball. Instead, she saw Edmund himself, mounted and riding toward her at a pace that suggested he had no intention of returning to his own celebration until he had answers. "Your Grace," she called out, half warning, half plea, "please, go back to your guests. This is not—" "I do not care about my guests," he said, bringing his horse to a stop beside her. In the moonlight, his expression was unreadable, but his voice carried none of the polished calm he had shown inside the ballroom. "I care about why a woman who looked at me tonight the way you did would run from a simple dance as though her life depended on it." Eleanor said nothing. She could not trust her voice. "I will not force you to tell me here, in the cold, on the side of a road," Edmund continued, dismounting to stand before her. "But I will not leave you to walk alone in the dark either, whatever your reasons for fleeing my house. Let me see you safely to wherever you intended to go. That is all I ask tonight." It was, Eleanor thought, both the kindest and most dangerous offer anyone had made her in years, and she had no idea, standing shivering on that dark road, whether accepting it would save her, or destroy everything she had spent 3 years trying to protect. Eleanor did not accept his offer that night, not entirely. She allowed him to walk beside her only as far as the crossroads, where she insisted she could manage the rest of the way alone, and Edmund, though clearly unwilling, respected her wishes enough to let her go. He watched her disappear down the lane toward her aunt's small house, then turned his horse back toward the estate with a plan already forming in his mind. He would not simply forget her, whatever she believed. He intended to learn her name properly, her circumstances, and whatever it was that had frightened her badly enough to abandon a duke in the middle of his own ball. A man of his position had resources most people did not, and he intended to use every one of them. It took him only 2 days to learn her full name from the guest list his housekeeper had carefully recorded, and only 2 more to learn, through careful and discreet inquiry among acquaintances who moved in the same circles as Gerald Whitfield, that Eleanor was engaged, or very nearly engaged, to Viscount Nathaniel Crane. The information troubled him more than he expected. He had met Crane on several occasions and found him to be a man more interested in appearances and old family names than in genuine character, a man widely known among his peers to be drowning in debts he worked hard to conceal. That such a man should be matched with a woman as clearly unhappy as Eleanor had seemed struck Edmund as deeply wrong, though he could not yet say precisely why it troubled him so much, beyond the plain fact that he had not been able to stop thinking about her since the moment she vanished. He decided, against the advice of his own better judgment, to call on her directly. The visit did not go as he hoped. When he arrived at the modest house where Eleanor lived with her aunt, he was informed by a nervous housemaid that Miss Whitfield was not receiving visitors, and through the front window, he caught only a brief glimpse of Eleanor herself, standing rigid near the hearth, before she disappeared further into the house rather than come to greet him. He left his card and departed. more determined than ever to understand what was happening behind that carefully guarded door. It was Eleanor's aunt, Margaret, who eventually gave him the opening he needed. She approached him 3 days later at a small gathering neither of them had expected the other to attend, drawing him aside with the quiet urgency of a woman who had been carrying a burden too heavy to hold alone much longer. "Your Grace," she said quietly, glancing around to ensure they were not overheard, "I do not know what passed between you and my niece the night of your ball, but I believe you may be the only person with enough standing to help her, if you are willing." Edmund's attention sharpened immediately. "Tell me what is happening to her." Margaret hesitated only a moment before the words spilled out, quiet and urgent, as though she had been waiting for permission to finally say them aloud. She told him of Gerald's guardianship, of the inheritance that had slowly disappeared under his management, of the threats made against her own small household should Eleanor ever speak against him, and finally, of the arrangement with Viscount Crane, a marriage designed entirely to settle Gerald's debts at Eleanor's expense. "She has told no one," Margaret finished, her eyes bright with worry. "She believes silence protects us, but I fear silence will only carry her further into a marriage that will make her miserable for the rest of her life, and there is nothing I can do to stop it. I have no standing, no resources, nothing Gerald cannot simply overrule." Edmund said very little in response, but something in his expression told Margaret that her words had not fallen on indifferent ears. He thanked her carefully, asked her to say nothing of their conversation to Eleanor, and departed with a plan already forming behind his composed exterior. He understood now why Eleanor had run. He understood the fear that had driven her away from him that night, and rather than diminishing his interest in her, the knowledge only deepened his determination to see the situation resolved properly, and to see Eleanor free of a guardian who had spent 3 years quietly stealing both her fortune and her future. But Edmund also understood, with the caution that had made him a careful and respected duke rather than a reckless one, that acting too quickly or too publicly could do more harm than good. If he confronted Gerald directly without proof, the man would simply deny everything, tighten his control over Eleanor further, and possibly accelerate the wedding date to remove any opportunity for interference. If he approached Eleanor again too forcefully, he risked frightening her into deeper silence, or worse, into believing that involving him had only made her situation more dangerous. He needed proof of Gerald's mismanagement of the inheritance, proof solid enough to stand against any denial, and he needed a way to reach Eleanor privately, without alerting her guardian to his continued interest, so that she might trust him enough to confirm what her aunt had already revealed. It took nearly 3 weeks to gather what he needed. Edmund engaged the services of a solicitor known for discretion and thoroughness, a man who had once helped untangle a similarly complicated inheritance dispute for a distant relation, and set him quietly to work examining whatever records could be found regarding the Whitfield estate and Gerald's management of it. The findings, when they came, were damning. Gerald had forged Eleanor's signature on at least 4 separate occasions to authorize withdrawals and transfers that had never been properly explained. He had invested a significant portion of her remaining inheritance in a shipping venture that had failed within months, a failure he had never disclosed to Eleanor at all. And most damning of all, the solicitor uncovered a private letter, carelessly filed among Gerald's business correspondence, in which he discussed the arrangement with Viscount Crane in explicit financial terms, describing Eleanor not as a niece to be cared for, but as a debt to be settled. Armed with this evidence, Edmund faced a difficult decision. He could take the proof directly to Eleanor, risking that Gerald might discover the investigation before any confrontation could take place. He could take it to the courts, though legal proceedings moved slowly, and Gerald's remaining influence in certain circles might delay or complicate matters further than Edmund was willing to risk, given how close the wedding date had grown. Or he could confront Gerald directly, using the threat of public exposure to force his hand before the marriage could take place. He chose, in the end, to do all 3, but carefully, and in an order designed to protect Eleanor from harm at every step. His first move was the most delicate. He needed to speak with Eleanor herself, to warn her of what he had discovered, and to give her the choice of how to proceed, rather than simply acting on her behalf without her knowledge or consent. He understood, better now than he had the night of the ball, that Eleanor had spent 3 years having every decision about her life made by someone else. He had no intention of becoming another person who decided her future without asking her first. He arranged, through Margaret, a meeting at a small church on the edge of the village, a place Eleanor visited regularly and where Gerald rarely accompanied her, considering such visits beneath his attention. Margaret delivered the message carefully, framing it only as an old family friend wishing to speak with Eleanor about a private matter, careful not to reveal Edmund's involvement until Eleanor herself agreed to the meeting. Eleanor arrived at the church on a gray afternoon, uncertain what to expect, and found Edmund waiting near the back pew, his expression grave in a way that immediately told her something significant had happened. "Your Grace," she said, glancing nervously toward the door as though expecting Gerald to appear at any moment. "You should not have come. If anyone sees us together—" "I know what your guardian has done," Edmund said quietly, cutting through her nervousness with the plain honesty he had promised himself he would offer her. "I know about the inheritance, the forged signatures, the arrangement with Viscount Crane. Your aunt told me some of it, and my solicitor has found proof of the rest." Eleanor went very still, the color draining from her face. "You had no right." "I know," Edmund said before she could finish. "I know I overstepped, and I am sorry for the fear that must cause you. But I could not simply forget what I saw in your face the night of the ball, and once your aunt confirmed my worst suspicions, I could not stand by and do nothing, while your guardian sold you into a marriage designed only to settle his own debts." Eleanor sank onto the nearest pew, her hands trembling in her lap. 3 years of careful silence, of swallowed anger and folded fear, suddenly felt impossibly heavy now that someone else knew the truth of it. "If Gerald learns what you have discovered," she whispered, "he will not simply be angry. He has threatened my aunt's home before, my cousin's education. If you expose him publicly, I do not know what he might do to protect himself from ruin." "I have thought of that," Edmund said, sitting beside her, close enough to offer comfort, but careful not to overstep further than he already had, "which is why I do not intend to expose him publicly. Not yet. I intend to confront him privately first, with proof he cannot deny, and give him a choice between quiet consequences and far louder ones. But I will not do anything, Eleanor, without your agreement. This is your life, not mine, and you have had far too little say in it already." For the first time since he had known her, Eleanor looked at him not with fear or careful politeness, but with something closer to hope, tentative and fragile, as though she was afraid to trust it fully. "What would you have me do?" she asked quietly. "Tell me everything," Edmund said, "all of it, in your own words, so that when I face your guardian, I face him with the truth exactly as you know it, not merely as your aunt or my solicitor understood it. And then, together, we decide how to stop this wedding before it happens." And so, in the quiet gray light of that small church, Eleanor finally allowed herself to speak the truth she had carried alone for 3 long years, the theft, the threats, the slow erosion of every choice that should have belonged to her, while Edmund listened without interrupting, his anger growing quietly beneath his calm exterior with every detail she revealed. By the time she finished, the afternoon had faded toward evening, and something between them had shifted permanently. Eleanor no longer felt entirely alone in the fight for her own future, and Edmund understood, with a clarity that surprised him, that he was no longer simply intrigued by a mysterious woman who had vanished from his ball. He was determined, whatever it cost him, to see her free. "We do not have much time," Eleanor said finally, wiping at her eyes with the back of her glove. "Gerald intends to move the wedding date forward. He told me only yesterday that the engagement will be announced within the week, and the marriage will follow within a month after that." Edmund's jaw tightened. "Then we will need to move quickly as well. Trust me, Eleanor. I know this is difficult, given everything you have survived. But trust me, and we will find a way through this together." She nodded slowly, and for the first time in 3 years, Eleanor Whitfield allowed herself to believe that her future might still belong to her after all. Word of the accelerated engagement reached Edmund faster than he expected. Gerald, eager to secure the arrangement before any complication could interfere, announced the formal engagement between Eleanor and Viscount Nathaniel Crane only 4 days after Eleanor's meeting with Edmund at the church, catching them both off guard, and forcing every careful plan they had begun to shift into something far more urgent. Eleanor learned of the announcement from Gerald himself, delivered over breakfast with the same flat satisfaction he always carried when arranging her life without her consent. "The notice will appear in the county paper by the end of the week," he told her, buttering his toast as though discussing nothing more significant than the weather. "Viscount Crane is eager to proceed quickly. The wedding itself will take place within the month, at his estate. You should begin preparing whatever belongings you wish to bring with you." Eleanor set down her fork carefully, forcing her hands to remain steady despite the panic rising sharp and cold through her chest. "So soon?" "The sooner it is settled, the sooner certain difficulties resolve themselves," Gerald said, and something in the way he said it told Eleanor he suspected more than he was letting on. "I trust there is no reason for delay, Eleanor, unless you have developed some objection I should know about." She met his eyes and forced herself to hold perfectly still. "No objection, sir." But Gerald was not entirely convinced, and later that same day, Eleanor learned from a nervous housemaid that he had been asking pointed questions about her recent movements, including a visit to the village church that he had not authorized. Someone had seen her there, someone loyal enough to Gerald to mention it, and though the housemaid could not say whether Gerald knew Edmund had been present as well, the warning was clear enough. Their meetings could no longer remain secret for long. Eleanor sent word to Edmund that evening through Margaret, a short note carried carefully to avoid suspicion, warning him that Gerald had grown watchful, and that whatever plan they intended to pursue would need to happen quickly, before the wedding date arrived, or before Gerald discovered the extent of Edmund's involvement. Edmund received the note with a grim understanding that the time for careful, patient investigation had passed. He called his solicitor to the estate that same night, reviewed every piece of evidence they had gathered regarding Gerald's mismanagement of Eleanor's inheritance, and began drafting a plan to confront Gerald directly, one designed to give the man no room to maneuver once the truth was placed before him. But confrontation alone would not be enough, Edmund realized. Even with proof of forged signatures and stolen funds, Gerald retained legal guardianship over Eleanor until she reached the age required for full independence, or until she married. And a cornered man with nothing left to lose might act rashly rather than surrender quietly. Edmund needed a way to protect Eleanor immediately, not merely to threaten Gerald into eventual compliance. The solution, when it came to him, was both simple and complicated in equal measure. English law permitted a woman to marry without her guardian's consent under certain circumstances, particularly if credible evidence of financial abuse or endangerment could be presented before a magistrate. If Eleanor married Edmund himself quickly and with proper legal standing behind the union, Gerald's guardianship would end immediately, and whatever remained of her inheritance, along with Eleanor's safety, would pass beyond his reach entirely. It was not a proposal Edmund intended to make lightly, nor one he wished Eleanor to accept out of desperation rather than genuine feeling. But circumstances had left them very little time for a more traditional courtship, and Edmund understood that whatever choice Eleanor made now would need to be made quickly, with full knowledge of both the danger she faced and the alternative he was prepared to offer. He arranged another meeting, this time at Margaret's own house rather than the church, judging it safer given Gerald's growing suspicion. Eleanor arrived pale and visibly exhausted, the strain of the accelerated engagement clearly wearing on her, and Edmund wasted no time on formalities once they were alone in the small parlor. "Gerald intends to move the wedding forward even further," Eleanor told him immediately, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "He informed me this morning that the date has been set for 2 weeks from now, not a month. I do not know how much time we truly have left." Edmund nodded, having half expected as much. "Then we do not have time for a slow legal process alone. I have another proposal, Eleanor, one I would not offer under different circumstances, but given everything you are facing, I believe it may be the fastest way to secure your safety." He explained the legal mechanism carefully, the way a marriage between them would immediately end Gerald's guardianship, protect whatever remained of her inheritance from further theft, and place her beyond Viscount Crane's reach entirely, since a woman already married could not be forced into a second engagement regardless of what arrangement her former guardian had made. Eleanor listened in stunned silence, her mind working quickly through the implications of what he was suggesting. "You are proposing marriage," she said slowly, "not out of genuine feeling, but as a means of protecting me from Gerald." "I am proposing marriage," Edmund corrected gently, "because I have not been able to stop thinking of you since the night you vanished from my ballroom, and because I believe, given more ordinary circumstances, I would have arrived at this same request eventually, regardless of your guardian's schemes. But I will not pretend the timing is not also driven by necessity. You deserve honesty from me, Eleanor, especially now." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears she had been fighting back for days. "This is not how I imagined such a moment," she admitted quietly. "Rushed, desperate, born from danger rather than courtship." "No," Edmund agreed, "but I would rather offer you an imperfect solution that keeps you safe than a perfect one that arrives too late to matter. The choice remains entirely yours, Eleanor. I will not pressure you into a marriage you do not want, whatever danger Gerald represents. But if you are willing, I believe we can end his control over your life within days rather than weeks." Eleanor sat quietly for a long moment, weighing the enormity of what he was offering against the desperate narrowness of her remaining options. She thought of Viscount Crane's cold indifference toward her as a person, of Gerald's years of quiet cruelty disguised as guardianship, of her aunt and cousins who remained vulnerable to Gerald's retaliation regardless of what Eleanor herself decided. And she thought too of the brief, warm conversation she had shared with Edmund the night of the ball, before fear had driven her to run from something that had felt, however briefly, like genuine possibility. "I am willing," she said finally, her voice steadier than she expected. "Not merely out of fear of Gerald, though I will not pretend that fear plays no part in my decision, but because I believe, given the chance to know you properly, without threats and schemes hanging over every conversation, I might have arrived here regardless." Edmund reached for her hand, and for the first time since the night of the ball, Eleanor allowed herself to take it without hesitation. "Then we move quickly," Edmund said, "before Gerald learns enough to interfere. I will secure a special license within days, quietly enough to avoid his notice until the marriage is already legally binding. Once it is done, his guardianship ends, and whatever schemes remain between him and Viscount Crane become entirely irrelevant." The plan, though sound in principle, carried significant risk. Special licenses, while faster than traditional bans requiring weeks of public notice, still required careful arrangement, and any hint of Edmund's involvement reaching Gerald before the marriage took place could prompt him to act rashly, perhaps moving Eleanor away from Margaret's protection entirely, or accelerating the wedding to Viscount Crane even further to close the window of opportunity. They agreed to proceed with extreme caution. Eleanor would maintain her outward composure, giving Gerald no reason to suspect anything had changed, while Edmund worked quietly through his solicitor and personal connections to secure the necessary license and arrange a private ceremony at his own estate chapel, small and unannounced, before Gerald or Viscount Crane could learn enough to interfere. For 4 days, the plan proceeded smoothly. Edmund's solicitor secured the special license through careful, discreet channels, and Edmund himself made arrangements for a private ceremony to take place on the 5th day, early in the morning, before most of the county had even risen for breakfast. But on the evening before the planned ceremony, everything nearly fell apart. Eleanor was summoned unexpectedly to Gerald's study, and the moment she entered, she understood immediately that something had gone wrong. Gerald sat behind his desk, his expression colder and more dangerous than she had ever seen it, a letter clutched in his hand that she recognized, with a sinking dread, as correspondence between Edmund's solicitor and the office issuing marriage licenses. "Explain this," Gerald said quietly, sliding the letter across the desk toward her, "before I decide precisely how much trouble you have caused this family." Eleanor stared at the letter, her mind racing through every possible response, and finding none that would satisfy the fury barely contained beneath Gerald's cold exterior. Denial seemed pointless given the evidence already in his hand, yet confirmation felt equally dangerous, a door she could not close again once opened. "I do not know how that letter came into your possession," she said carefully, choosing honesty over an outright lie she doubted would hold, "but I will not deny that a marriage has been discussed." Gerald's hand tightened around the edge of his desk. "You would defy the arrangement I made for you. Throw away a respectable engagement to Viscount Crane, to run off with a duke who knows nothing of loyalty or family obligation, who has clearly turned your head with pretty words and grand promises." "He knows exactly what you have done," Eleanor said, and for the first time in 3 years, she did not lower her eyes when speaking to her guardian. "The forged signatures, the stolen inheritance, the shipping venture you never disclosed. He knows all of it, Gerald, and so do I." The color drained from Gerald's face, replaced almost immediately by a dangerous, brittle anger that Eleanor had learned long ago to fear. "You dare accuse me of theft after everything I have provided for you and your aunt these past 3 years?" "I dare because it is true," Eleanor said, her voice trembling but steady enough to continue. "And because I am done pretending otherwise simply to keep peace in a house where peace has never truly existed for me." Gerald rose from behind his desk, and for a moment, Eleanor feared he might strike her, something he had threatened more than once in quieter, crueler moments over the years but had never actually done, restrained always by his careful concern for appearances. Instead, he stood very still, breathing hard, working through the implications of what she had revealed. "If you go through with this marriage," he said finally, his voice low and dangerous, "I will ensure Viscount Crane understands precisely how you have humiliated him, how you have broken an engagement already announced in the county paper. I will ensure your aunt loses whatever small comfort remains to her, and your cousins lose whatever education I have generously provided, and I will fight this marriage in every court willing to hear me, arguing that a duke has manipulated a vulnerable young woman under my guardianship for his own amusement." "You have no evidence of manipulation," Eleanor said, though her voice wavered slightly at the threat against her aunt and cousins. "And Edmund's solicitor has already secured proof of your own misconduct. If you fight this in court, Gerald, you risk exposing everything you have done, not merely to me, but to the entire county." For a long, tense moment, neither of them spoke. each measuring the other's resolve, each calculating exactly how far the other was willing to go. "Get out of my sight," Gerald said finally, his voice quiet and cold in a way that frightened Eleanor more than shouting would have. "We will discuss this further tomorrow, once I have decided precisely how to handle your betrayal." Eleanor left his study with her heart pounding, understanding immediately that tomorrow would be too late. Whatever Gerald intended to do, he would act before the ceremony could take place, and she had no way to warn Edmund quickly enough through their usual careful channels without risking discovery. She made a decision that night that surprised even herself, one born entirely of desperation and the growing certainty that safety, if it came at all, would only come through boldness rather than continued caution. She waited until the household had settled into sleep, slipped from her room with only a small bag of essential belongings, and made her way on foot through the darkness toward Ashcombe Estate, praying she would reach Edmund before Gerald discovered her absence and set into motion whatever retaliation he had been quietly planning. The journey took nearly 2 hours on foot, through cold, unfamiliar roads lit only by moonlight, and Eleanor's mind filled the silence with every possible disaster that might unfold before morning. She imagined Gerald discovering her missing and immediately sending word to Viscount Crane, painting her flight as scandal rather than escape. She imagined him arriving at Ashcombe Estate himself, demanding her return with legal authority still technically on his side until the marriage made it otherwise. She imagined 100 ways the night might end in disaster rather than safety. When she finally reached the gates of Ashcombe Estate, exhausted and shivering, she was met by a startled night guard who recognized her from her previous visits and, after a moment of hesitation, allowed her through and sent urgent word to wake the Duke immediately. Edmund appeared within minutes, still dressed in the clothes he had apparently not yet changed from earlier that evening, his expression shifting from confusion to alarm the moment he saw the state Eleanor was in. "Eleanor, what happened?" he asked, guiding her quickly inside, away from the cold night air. She told him everything in rushed, breathless sentences, the intercepted letter, Gerald's fury, his threats against her aunt and cousins, his promise to fight the marriage in court and destroy whatever reputation Edmund still hoped to protect for her. "He knows everything," Eleanor finished, "and I do not believe he will wait until morning to act. I did not know what else to do but come to you directly." Edmund's expression hardened with the same quiet determination she had first glimpsed the night he chased her from his ball. "You did exactly the right thing. We will not wait until morning either. I will send word to the chapel immediately. We proceed with the ceremony tonight, as soon as it can be properly arranged." "Tonight?" Eleanor asked, startled. "Is that even possible?" "The license is already secured," Edmund said, already moving toward the door to wake his household staff. "I have a clergyman within riding distance who owes my family a debt of gratitude he has long wished to repay. It is unconventional, and it is rushed, but given what you have told me of your guardian's intentions, I believe unconventional and rushed is exactly what this situation requires." Within the hour, Ashcombe Estate had come alive with quiet, urgent activity. Servants were roused to prepare the small private chapel on the grounds. A rider was dispatched to fetch the clergyman Edmund had mentioned, and Margaret, informed by urgent messenger of the sudden change in plans, arrived breathless and disheveled just before dawn, having ridden through the dark herself the moment she received word that Eleanor had fled to Ashcombe Estate rather than face Gerald's wrath alone. "He came to my house not an hour after you must have left," Margaret told Eleanor, embracing her tightly the moment she arrived. "He was searching for you, furious, accusing me of helping you deceive him. I told him nothing, but I do not believe he was convinced. He may come here next, Eleanor, once he exhausts every other possibility." Edmund, overhearing this, turned to his household steward with quiet, controlled urgency. "Double the guard at the gates. If Lord Whitfield arrives before the ceremony concludes, he is to be received courteously, but he is not to interrupt what takes place in that chapel. Is that understood?" The steward nodded and departed immediately to see the instruction carried out. As the sky outside began to lighten toward dawn, Eleanor stood in a small antechamber near the chapel, wearing a simple dress hastily provided by one of the household maids in place of the traveling clothes she had worn through the night, her hair pinned quickly but carefully by Margaret's trembling hands. "Are you certain of this?" Margaret asked quietly, studying her niece's exhausted but determined face. "Once this is done, Eleanor, there is no undoing it." Eleanor thought of 3 years of careful obedience, of forged signatures and stolen inheritance, of a marriage to Nathaniel Crane that would have consumed the rest of her life in quiet, dignified misery. She thought of Edmund's steady presence beside her through every difficult conversation of the past weeks, his willingness to place his own reputation and resources at risk, for a woman he had known only a short time. "I am certain," she said, and found, to her own surprise, that she meant it entirely. Outside the chapel doors, the sound of hooves on gravel announced a rider approaching fast, and everyone in the antechamber went very still, uncertain whether it was the clergyman finally arriving or Gerald himself, having tracked Eleanor's flight through the dark to its final destination. The rider proved to be the clergyman, an older man named Reverend Holloway who had served the Ashcombe family for decades and asked no questions beyond what was strictly necessary, as he was hurried into the small chapel and briefed quickly on the unusual circumstances of the ceremony he had been summoned to perform. He agreed without hesitation, understanding enough from Edmund's grave explanation to recognize the urgency behind the request. Eleanor and Edmund stood before him only minutes later, the chapel lit by candlelight rather than the full morning sun still gathering strength outside, with only Margaret and a handful of trusted household staff present to witness what should have been, under different circumstances, a grand and celebrated occasion. The ceremony itself was brief, stripped of the elaborate ritual that typically accompanied a duke's marriage, but no less binding for its simplicity. Eleanor spoke her vows in a voice that grew steadier with each word, watching Edmund's steady, unwavering attention throughout, and felt, for the first time since her parents' deaths, that she was making a choice entirely her own, free of guardians and arrangements and threats disguised as obligation. They had just exchanged the final vows, Reverend Holloway's voice rising toward the concluding blessing, when the chapel doors burst open behind them. Gerald Whitfield stood in the doorway, breathing hard from what had clearly been a desperate ride through the night, his face contorted with a fury that had abandoned all pretense of composure. "Stop this immediately," he demanded, striding into the chapel despite the household guards attempting to restrain him. "This marriage is not legitimate. She is under my guardianship, and I have not consented to this arrangement." Reverend Holloway, unshaken by the interruption, calmly finished the final words of the blessing before addressing Gerald directly. "The ceremony is complete, Lord Whitfield. The marriage is legally binding under a properly secured license, witnessed and blessed according to the law. Your guardianship, as of this moment, no longer holds authority over the Duchess of Ashcombe." The title landed in the chapel like a physical blow. Eleanor watched Gerald's face shift rapidly through disbelief, fury, and finally something closer to panic as the full implications settled over him. "You planned this," he said, turning his fury toward Edmund, now that the ceremony itself could not be undone. "You manipulated a vulnerable young woman under my care for your own purposes, and I will see this marriage challenged in every court in the country." "You are welcome to try," Edmund said, his voice calm but carrying an edge Eleanor had not heard from him before, "though I would advise against it, given the evidence my solicitor has already gathered regarding your management of Eleanor's inheritance. Forged signatures, undisclosed investments, funds diverted for your own use rather than her benefit. Should you challenge this marriage in court, Lord Whitfield, you will find yourself defending far more than your wounded pride." Gerald's face went pale, the threat landing with obvious weight. He glanced toward Eleanor, perhaps hoping to find some hesitation he could exploit, some remaining fear he could use to regain control, but found instead a steadiness in her expression that had not existed 3 years earlier, when he had first arrived at her parents' house dressed in mourning black in calculation. "I trusted you with my father's estate," Eleanor said quietly, "and you used that trust to steal from me for 3 years while threatening the only family I had left to keep me silent. I am no longer silent, Gerald, and I am no longer under your control. Whatever remains of my inheritance, Edmund's solicitor will ensure is properly accounted for and returned. And if you attempt to harm my aunt or cousins in retaliation for this, know that the evidence already gathered against you will find its way to every magistrate and every drawing room in the county." For a long moment, Gerald said nothing, the fight visibly draining out of him as he recognized, perhaps for the first time, that the balance of power between them had shifted entirely and permanently. Whatever schemes remained to him, whatever threats he might still attempt, he no longer held the leverage that had kept Eleanor silent and obedient for 3 long years. "This is not finished," he said finally, though the words carried far less weight than his earlier fury had suggested. "Viscount Crane will not accept this humiliation quietly." "Viscount Crane's arrangement was with you, not with me," Eleanor replied. "Whatever debt you owe him for breaking that engagement is a matter between the two of you, not mine to resolve." Gerald left the chapel without another word, his footsteps echoing sharply against the stone floor, and Eleanor watched him go with a strange mixture of relief and lingering wariness, uncertain whether his defeat that morning marked a true end to his interference or merely a temporary retreat. Edmund seemed to sense her uncertainty, taking her hand gently once the chapel doors closed behind Gerald's retreating figure. Whatever he attempts next, Eleanor, he no longer has legal standing to force you into anything against your will. My solicitor will ensure the courts understand exactly what evidence exists against him, should he attempt any further interference. The following weeks proved Edmund's assurance well-founded. Gerald, faced with the mounting evidence Edmund's solicitor had gathered, and the very real threat of criminal prosecution for the forged signatures and stolen inheritance, chose ultimately to retreat rather than fight a battle he had little chance of winning. He quietly settled what remained of his debts through other means, avoided public scandal by choosing not to pursue legal challenges against a marriage that had already been properly and legally completed, and gradually faded from Eleanor's life entirely, no longer possessing any authority or leverage over her future. Viscount Crane, for his part, expressed loud but ultimately hollow outrage over the broken engagement, though it emerged within weeks that he had already begun pursuing a similarly arranged match with another family desperate enough to overlook his debts in exchange for his title. His anger, it turned out, had far more to do with wounded pride than genuine affection for Eleanor herself, and the scandal surrounding the broken engagement faded from county gossip within a season, replaced by newer, more entertaining rumors, as such things always eventually were. Eleanor's aunt and cousins, freed from Gerald's threats entirely once his guardianship ended, found their circumstances improved considerably under the quiet, generous support Edmund insisted on providing, not as a condition of the marriage but simply as an extension of the family Eleanor had brought with her into their union. As for Eleanor herself, the transition from a life of careful obedience and constant fear into her new position as Duchess of Ashcombe did not happen instantly or without difficulty. She spent the early weeks of her marriage learning to trust that her opinions genuinely mattered, that Edmund's patience with her hesitation was not merely polite performance but genuine understanding of everything she had survived. Slowly, carefully, she allowed herself to believe that the life stretching ahead of her belonged entirely to herself, shared willingly with a man who had chosen to chase her into the night rather than simply let her disappear. Nearly 2 months after their hurried chapel ceremony, Edmund proposed something Eleanor had not expected. The county, having recovered from the scandal and rumor surrounding their unconventional marriage, remained eager for the kind of grand social occasion that Ashcombe Estate had always been known to provide, and Edmund suggested they host a proper ball, one intended not merely for celebration but for something more specific and meaningful to both of them. "I owe you a dance," he told her one evening, as they walked together through the estate gardens in the fading light of early evening, "the one interrupted the night you vanished from my ballroom. I would like the chance to finish it properly, in front of everyone this time, with nothing left to hide." Eleanor smiled, the easy, genuine smile that had become far more common in the months since her marriage than it had ever been during the years under Gerald's guardianship. "I would like that very much." The ball, when it finally took place, drew nearly the entire county, curious to see the Duke and his new Duchess together, in the same grand room where their unconventional courtship had first begun. Eleanor moved through the evening with none of the careful invisibility she had once relied upon to survive, greeting guests with genuine warmth, no longer needing to fold herself smaller to avoid unwanted attention. When the musicians finally began the opening notes of the final set, Edmund found her exactly as he had that first night, near the tall windows overlooking the garden, though this time she did not hesitate or search for an escape when he extended his hand. "May I have this dance, Duchess?" he asked, a slight smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "You may," Eleanor replied, taking his hand without a moment's hesitation. They danced the final set together in full view of the entire county, the same dance that had been interrupted months earlier by fear and desperation, completed now in safety and genuine happiness. Eleanor rested her hand in Edmund's with complete trust, moving through the steps with none of the anxious calculation that had governed every moment of her life under Gerald's control. As the dance concluded and the room erupted into warm applause, Edmund leaned close enough for only Eleanor to hear. "No more disappearing before the final dance," he said softly. Eleanor smiled up at him, her eyes bright with happiness that had once felt impossibly distant. No more disappearing at all. Outside the tall windows, the garden lay quiet under a clear night sky, the same garden where Eleanor had once stood at the edge of the ballroom, trying desperately to remain unseen. Now, standing at the center of the room, in the arms of the man who had chased her into the night and refused to let her go, she understood finally that some things, once found, were never meant to disappear again. A year into their marriage, Eleanor found herself standing once again in the gardens of Ashcombe Estate, though this time the season had turned toward autumn, the trees along the pathway shifting slowly into shades of gold and amber, She had come to love these gardens more than any place she had known before, not merely for their beauty but for everything they represented. The quiet turning point where her old life had finally ended and her new one had properly begun. Margaret visited often that autumn, her own circumstances transformed entirely since Gerald's fall from influence. With the modest but steady support Edmund provided, she had settled into a comfortable cottage near the estate, close enough to see Eleanor regularly, far enough to maintain the independence she had rarely enjoyed during the years Gerald controlled the household finances. Eleanor's younger cousins, freed from the uncertainty that had shadowed their education under Gerald's grudging and unreliable support, had both been enrolled in proper schooling, their futures no longer dependent on the whims of a man who had only ever seen them as burdens to be managed rather than family to be cherished. Gerald himself had retreated almost entirely from society, his reputation quietly diminished by rumors that, while never fully confirmed in public record, had spread widely enough through careful whispers to ensure few respectable families wished to associate with him any longer. He lived now in a much reduced situation, his remaining resources swallowed by the very debts he had once hoped Eleanor's inheritance would settle, a fate Eleanor found she could observe with a certain quiet satisfaction, rather than the fear that had once defined every thought of him. Viscount Crane had married within the year, as expected, to a young woman from a family even more desperate than Gerald had been to overlook his debts in exchange for his title. Eleanor heard occasional reports of his continuing financial troubles through county gossip, delivered always with a note of amusement rather than genuine concern, and found she felt nothing toward him beyond a distant, faded relief that her own life had taken an entirely different path. Edmund, for his part, had grown only more devoted as their marriage settled into its natural rhythms. He made a habit, whenever his duties allowed, of joining Eleanor in the gardens during the quiet hours of early evening, and it was during one such evening walk that autumn that he shared news which would shape their family's future in ways neither of them had fully anticipated. "I have been thinking," he said, as they walked slowly along the same path where he had once promised to finish their interrupted dance, "about the ballroom, and the final dance, and everything that began there. I have been thinking we might make it a tradition." Eleanor glanced at him curiously. "A tradition?" "An annual ball," Edmund explained, "hosted each year on the same evening, open to families throughout the county, regardless of their standing or fortune. I have seen too clearly, through your own experience, how easily a person can become trapped by circumstances beyond their control, how quickly wealth and reputation can be used to silence someone who has no power to resist. I would like our home to become known for something better than that. A place where young women in difficult circumstances might find support, connection, perhaps even protection, should they need it." Eleanor felt her eyes fill with tears, moved deeply by the proposal. "You wish to help others the way you helped me. I wish to ensure that what happened to you does not happen so easily to others," Edmund said, taking her hand as they continued walking. "You survived 3 years of quiet cruelty, because you had no one with the power or resources to intervene on your behalf. I would like our home, and our influence, to become exactly that resource for anyone else who might need it." The first annual ball took place that winter, drawing families from across the county, and quietly, carefully, Edmund and Eleanor began the work of building relationships with solicitors, magistrates, and charitable societies, dedicated to protecting vulnerable young women from exactly the kind of exploitation Eleanor herself had endured. It became, over the following years, one of the defining causes of their marriage, a shared purpose that deepened their bond far beyond the dramatic circumstances that had first brought them together. Eleanor never forgot the night she had tried to disappear before the final dance, the fear that had driven her into the darkness rather than risk the consequences of being truly seen, but she came to understand, as the years passed and her new life grew steady and secure around her, that running had not been her failure. It had been survival, the only tool available to a woman with no other means of protecting herself and the people she loved. What had changed everything, in the end, was not her own strength alone, though she had certainly needed every measure of it to survive 3 years under Gerald's control. It was Edmund's refusal to simply accept her disappearance as the end of the story, his willingness to follow her into the night rather than let a single unanswered question fade quietly into forgotten gossip. Standing now in the gardens where it had all truly begun, watching the autumn light fade gently toward evening, Eleanor understood that some stories did not end simply because the dancing stopped or the candles burned low. Some stories continued long after the final dance concluded, built slowly and carefully in the quiet, ordinary moments that followed, in gardens and conversations and the steady, patient work of building a life together worth protecting. She had disappeared once before a dance that should have changed everything. She had no intention of ever disappearing again.